Welcome to Justice Served. 3 months ago, my parents threw me out of their house in Millbrook Heights, calling me a failure who'd never amount to anything. Last week, FBI Director Jonathan Hartwell personally flew to my apartment to ask for my help stopping the biggest cyber threat in national security history. But let me tell you how we got there, because the journey from their disappointment to his desperation is a story about parents who thought they knew what success looked like and the daughter who proved them spectacularly wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Pack your things, Alexis. My mother, Diane Roswell, announced from the kitchen doorway, her voice carrying the finality of a court verdict. She stood there in her pressed navy blazer, the one she wore to parent-teacher conferences back when she still believed I might salvage my academic career. Your father and I have made our decision. The laptop screen in front of me flickered with lines of code I'd been debugging for the past 6 hours. Not homework, something far more important that they'd never understand. I didn't look up immediately, my fingers still dancing across the keys, finishing the encryption sequence that would close a backdoor vulnerability I'd discovered in a banking system's security framework. Did you hear me? Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor of our Millbrook Heights colonial, each step echoing through the house like a countdown timer. We're done enabling your delusions. My father, Richard Roswell, appeared behind her, his tie loosened from another 12-hour day at Consolidated Financial Group, where he managed portfolios for people who measured success in quarterly reports and country club memberships. His face carried that particular brand of disappointment I'd grown accustomed to, the look of a man whose daughter had failed to follow the script he'd written for her life. 3 semesters at Whitmore University, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of tuition payments that felt wasted to him. A 2.1 GPA, no internships, no job prospects, no direction? He paused, letting each failure land like a physical blow. Meanwhile, your trust fund money disappears into what? Computer equipment? Gaming nonsense? I finally closed the laptop, the code compilation completing with a soft chime they couldn't hear over their own frustration. The banking vulnerability was now patched, probably saving thousands of customers from having their accounts compromised. But to them, I'd just been playing on the computer again. It's not gaming, I said quietly, turning to face them. It's whatever excuse you're using this week to avoid growing up. Look at your cousin Jamie. She graduated summa cum laude from Westfield College, landed a job at Morrison & Associates law firm, and just got promoted to junior partner. She's 24, Alexis, same age as you. The comparison stung because it was designed to. Jamie Roswell Chen, the golden child of family gatherings, with her perfect grades, perfect job, and perfect adherence to the path our parents had laid out for all of us. She wore success like a designer handbag, expensive, visible, and meant to impress others. But Jamie doesn't understand cybersecurity, I said, my voice remaining steady despite the frustration building in my chest. She doesn't know how to trace digital footprints or identify state-sponsored attack vectors or— Stop! Richard's hand sliced through the air, cutting off my explanation. Just stop with the technical babble. We've heard it all before. You hide behind these computer words like they mean something, but the results speak for themselves. You're failing at life, Alexis. The words hung in the air between us, sharp and final. Failing at life. According to their metrics, grades, traditional career paths, social expectations, they weren't wrong. My transcript from Whitmore looked like a cautionary tale. My resume, if they had ever seen it, would seem empty to anyone who didn't understand that my real work happened in encrypted chat rooms and secure government servers. 2 weeks, Diane said, checking her watch like my eviction was another appointment in her busy schedule. Find somewhere else to live, we'll cover your security deposit for an apartment, but after that, you're financially independent. Maybe some real-world responsibility will help you figure out what you actually want to do with your life. I looked around the living room where I'd grown up, taking in the family photos arranged on the mantel. There I was at 8 years old, receiving a certificate for the regional science fair. At 12, holding my first programming trophy from the junior coding competition. At 16, shaking hands with the mayor after my app helped the city identify traffic pattern inefficiencies. All those moments when they'd been proud before they decided that traditional success was the only success that mattered.
What if I told you, I said slowly, choosing my words carefully, that what I do with computers isn't just a hobby? What if I told you that people in very important positions take my work seriously? Richard laughed. Not the warm laugh I remembered from childhood, but something brittle and tired. Alexis, we've been patient. We've listened to your stories about important projects and consulting work that never seems to pay bills or show up on any official records. We've watched you chase fantasies while your life falls apart. It's not fantasy, I said, my voice gaining strength. I've been working on classified projects. I can't tell you details because of security clearances, but security clearances? Diane's eyebrows shot up in the way they did when she caught me in what she assumed was a lie. Alexis, you failed Introduction to Political Science. You think the government is hiring college dropouts for classified work? The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so frustrating. They were right that I'd failed poli-sci, mostly because I'd been spending those class hours in secure video conferences with Department of Homeland Security analysts, helping them identify vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure systems. Professor Hamilton's lectures on the 3 branches of government felt less urgent than preventing actual cyber attacks on the electric grid. You have 2 weeks, Richard repeated, his decision final. We love you, but we won't enable this anymore. It's time for you to learn what the real world is like. They left me sitting in the living room, surrounded by the silence of a house that would soon no longer be my home. I opened my laptop again, staring at the screen where encrypted messages waited in secure channels they'd never see. Conversations with people whose names would be recognizable if I could share them. Appreciation for work that had prevented disasters they'd never know about. In 14 days, I'd be out of their house, officially a failure by their standards. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that in 15 days, everything they thought they understood about their disappointing daughter would change forever. The phone in my encrypted communication device would ring. The voice on the other end would identify himself as FBI Director Jonathan Hartwell, and he would address me with the respect my own parents had never shown. Agent Roswell, we need your help. But that was still 2 weeks away. For now, I was just their failure of a daughter packing my life into boxes while they slept soundly upstairs, convinced they were teaching me a valuable lesson about responsibility and real-world consequences. They had no idea they were about to learn a lesson themselves. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The next morning, I woke to the sound of hushed conversations drifting up from the kitchen. My parents' voices carried that careful tone people use when they're discussing someone they're worried the neighbors might overhear about. Spoke to Dr. Harrison at Whitmore yesterday, my father was saying as I descended the stairs. He confirmed what we suspected. Alexis hasn't attended a single class in 6 weeks. Not one. I paused on the landing, my hand gripping the banister. Dr. Harrison, my academic advisor, who'd been sending increasingly frantic emails about my attendance that I'd been too busy to properly address. He had no idea that during those missed classes, I'd been in secure video conferences with Department of Homeland Security analysts, helping them identify vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure systems. Professor Hamilton's lectures on the 3 branches of government felt less urgent when preventing actual cyber attacks on the electric grid. It's worse than we thought, Diane replied, her voice heavy with the particular exhaustion that comes from disappointed expectations. I called the bursar's office. She owes $12,000 in unpaid tuition for this semester alone. Money we thought was being used for her education has just vanished. They're not wrong about the tuition. The payments had been delayed because my consulting fees from various government contracts were processed through channels that took weeks to clear, and I couldn't exactly explain to the university billing office that my payment was held up by Department of Defense security protocols. I entered the kitchen to find them sitting across from each other at the breakfast table, a manila folder spread between them like evidence in a trial. Bank statements, university correspondence, printouts of my academic transcript, all the official documentation that painted me as an irresponsible failure. "Morning," I said, reaching for the coffee pot. "Sit down, Alexis," Richard said, not quite a request. "We need to discuss your future." I poured my coffee and sat, noting how they'd positioned themselves like an interview panel, united in their disappointment. The folder was angled so I could see its contents, my failures documented in neat, bureaucratic rows. "We've been thinking about this all night," Diane began, her voice taking on the measured tone she used for difficult conversations. "2 weeks might not be enough time for you to understand the seriousness of your situation."
My phone buzzed with an encrypted message. I glanced at it discreetly. An urgent communication from someone with the codename Cypher7 requesting my analysis of unusual network traffic patterns they'd detected in several federal systems. Time-sensitive. National security implications. "Are you listening to us?" Richard's voice sharpened. "This is exactly what we're talking about. You can't even focus on a conversation about your own future without getting distracted by that phone." "Sorry," I said, sliding the phone face down on the table. "I'm listening." "We've decided to implement some conditions," Diane continued. "If you want to continue living here beyond the 2-week deadline, you need to show us you're serious about changing your life." She pulled a printed list from the folder, the kind of itemized plan she used for managing her real estate projects. My path to redemption, neatly bullet-pointed. "First, you'll re-enroll at Whitmore for the spring semester and maintain a 3.5 GPA minimum, no exceptions. Second, you'll get a part-time job, something visible, legitimate, retail, food service, anything that appears on a W-2 form and teaches you about real work. Third, you'll attend weekly family dinners where we discuss your progress and goals. No phones, no distractions, no technical excuses. Fourth, you'll see Dr. Patricia Wine for career counseling. She helped the Morrison girl find her direction when she was struggling." I stared at the list, each requirement representing their complete misunderstanding of who I was and what I did. Career counseling from someone who probably thought cybersecurity was about installing antivirus software. A part-time job that would interfere with emergency response calls from federal agencies. Weekly check-ins like I was a teenager who'd been caught drinking. "What about my current work?" I asked carefully. "What work?" Richard's tone suggested he'd been waiting for this question. "Alexis, we've seen no evidence of any legitimate employment. No pay stubs, no tax documents, no references. These mysterious consulting jobs you claim to have, they don't exist in any form we can verify." The irony was crushing. They wanted verification of work that was classified at levels they didn't have clearance to know about. They wanted references from people whose names appear on no public directories. They wanted proof of income that was processed through government accounting systems designed to be invisible. "I know this is hard to accept," Diane said, her voice gentling in the way it did when she thought she was delivering necessary medicine. "But sometimes people create elaborate fantasies to avoid facing reality. The computer skills you have are impressive as hobbies, but they're not career material, not real career material." My phone buzzed again. Another encrypted message, this one marked with red priority indicators. A coordinated attack on infrastructure systems had been detected. Multiple agencies were requesting immediate consultation, lives potentially at stake. There it is again. Richard pointed at my phone like it was evidence of my failings. "Whatever's on that screen is more important to you than this conversation about your future. That's the problem, Alexis. You live in a virtual world where you think you're important, where you think you're making a difference, but reality is sitting right here at this table." I looked at both of them. These people who'd raised me, who'd celebrated my early achievements, who somehow convinced themselves that traditional markers of success were the only ones that mattered. They sat there with their folder of evidence, their bullet-pointed plan, their absolute certainty that they understood what was best for me. "You have until this evening to decide," Diane said, closing the folder with finality. "Accept our conditions and prove you're serious about changing, or pack your things and learn independence the hard way." They left me sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by the weight of their disappointment and the urgency of messages I couldn't answer in their presence. Through the window, I could see our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, tending her garden, a woman who'd raised 3 children according to the same playbook my parents were following: traditional education, traditional careers, traditional measures of worth. None of them understood that the world had changed, that the most critical battles were being fought in digital spaces they couldn't see, that their daughter wasn't a failure hiding behind computer fantasies. She was someone whose skills were so valuable that the highest levels of government sought her expertise. But I couldn't tell them that. Not yet. Not until the call that would change everything. For now, I was just their disappointing daughter, facing an ultimatum from people who loved me enough to try to save me from what they saw as delusion, but who couldn't see that they were the ones living in the past. That evening, I sat in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ultimatum letter my parents had formally typed up and slid under my door. It was printed on Richard's law firm header letter. Apparently, even my eviction needed to look professional. The conditions were listed in numbered paragraphs like a legal contract, complete with deadlines and consequences. My secure phone vibrated with an incoming encrypted call. The caller ID showed only a sequence of numbers I recognized immediately. I answered on the second ring. "Agent Roswell?" The voice was crisp, professional, tinged with an urgency I'd learned to read like a barometer. "Special Agent Cameron Price from the FBI's Cyber Division. We have a situation." I glanced at my bedroom door, listening for footsteps in the hallway. My parents were downstairs watching their evening news program, the volume turned up just loud enough to mask conversations. "I'm secure. What's the status?" "Operation Blackwater is compromised. Someone inside the organization leaked our investigation parameters. 3 assets are now exposed, and we believe there's going to be retaliation within the next 48 hours. I pulled up my encrypted partition, fingers flying across the keyboard as multiple screens populated with data streams. Operation Blackwater. 6 months of work tracing a cybercriminal organization that had been stealing classified military contractor data and selling it to foreign intelligence services. I'd been the one to identify their primary communication protocols and crack their encryption methods. "What kind of retaliation?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "They're planning to release everything they've stolen. Defense contracts, weapons specifications, personnel records for undercover operatives. If this data hits the internet, we're looking at a national security catastrophe." The irony wasn't lost on me. Downstairs, my parents were watching news anchors discuss threats to American security, completely unaware that their failure of a daughter was one of the people working to prevent those threats from materializing. "I need access to the secondary server array," I said, already establishing secure connections to systems most people didn't know existed. "And I'll need clearance for deep packet analysis on the compromised networks." "Already arranged. Director Hartwell signed off on whatever you need. He said to tell you this is priority alpha." Director Hartwell. Even the mention of his name carried weight in the intelligence community. FBI Director Jonathan Hartwell, the man who'd personally recruited me 2 years ago after I accidentally uncovered a state-sponsored cyber attack while working on what I'd thought was a routine corporate security audit. "Understood. Give me 30 minutes to establish countermeasures." "Agent Roswell," Price's voice carried a note of something I rarely heard from federal agents. "Genuine gratitude. We know what you're sacrificing to do this work. The secrecy, the isolation, it doesn't go unnoticed." After the call ended, I sat back in my desk chair staring at the screens that showed data flows my parents couldn't even conceptualize. Lines of code that represented the digital equivalent of stopping bullets in midair. numbers and algorithms that stood between criminal organizations and national catastrophe. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. "Alexis," my mother's voice, gentler than it had been during our kitchen confrontation. "Can I come in?" I quickly locked my screens, switching to a benign-looking programming tutorial that would support their narrative about my computer hobby. "Sure." Diane entered carrying 2 mugs of tea, an apparent peace offering. She set one on my desk, carefully avoiding the tangle of cables and external drives that connected me to networks she couldn't even imagine. "I wanted to talk to you," she said, settling on the edge of my bed, "without your father. Sometimes he can be intense about these things." She was trying, I realized. Despite her disappointment, despite her complete misunderstanding of my life, she was still my mother attempting to bridge a gap she could see but couldn't comprehend. "I know you think we don't understand," she continued, gesturing vaguely at my computer setup. "And maybe we don't. Technology moves so fast these days. But, Alexis, we see you staying up all night working on projects we can't see any results from. We see you getting more isolated, more secretive. From our perspective, it looks like I'm failing," I finished for her. "Like you're hiding," she corrected. "When you were younger, you'd show us everything. Remember the science fair projects? You'd explain every detail, walk us through every step. Now when we ask about your work, you give us technical jargon that might as well be a foreign language." I sipped the tea, buying myself time to choose words carefully. She wasn't wrong. I had become secretive, but not by choice. What if I told you that some of the work I do has to remain confidential? Not because I'm hiding from you, but because there are legal requirements about what I can and can't discuss. Her eyebrows rose slightly. Legal requirements? Non-disclosure agreements, security clearances, the kind of restrictions that come with certain types of consulting work. For a moment, something flickered in her expression. Not quite belief, but a crack in her certainty I was spinning fantasies. "Alexis, if that were true, if you really were doing legitimate work that required security clearances, wouldn't there be some way to verify that? Some official record or reference we could contact?" I set down the tea mug, meeting her eyes directly. "Mom, what do you know about the federal government's cybersecurity infrastructure?" "Not much," she admitted. "Why?" "Do you know how many cyber attacks the United States experiences every day? Not the ones you hear about on the news, the ones that get stopped before they become news." She shook her head. "Thousands. Every single day, people are trying to break into power grids, water treatment facilities, financial systems, military networks. Most Americans never hear about these attacks because there are people working around the clock to stop them." That's a real job? Stopping those attacks?" "It's not just a real job, Mom. It's one of the most critical jobs in national security. And it's almost entirely invisible. The better you are at it, the less anyone notices your work, because success means nothing bad happens." I could see her processing this, trying to reconcile her image of computer work as gaming and social media with the concept of invisible digital warfare. "But surely if you were doing that kind of work, there would be some way for us to know? Some contact person or agency that could confirm." "Mom, if I were hypothetically working on classified cybersecurity projects, do you really think the government would verify that information to my parents? Do you think they'd risk operational security to satisfy family concerns?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the encrypted drives and specialized equipment that surrounded my workspace. Equipment that cost more than most people's cars, purchased with consulting fees that appeared in my accounts from sources that couldn't be easily traced. "You're asking me to trust you," she said finally. "I'm asking you to consider that maybe success doesn't always look the way you expect it to." My secure phone buzzed with another encrypted message. Time-sensitive updates on Operation Blackwater. 3 more hours until the criminals threatened data release. Digital bombs waiting to explode if I couldn't defuse them in time. "You should answer that," Diane said, noticing my glance at the phone. "It might be important." I looked at her, searching her face for any sign that she was beginning to understand. It usually is. She stood, pausing at the door. "Alexis, if what you're telling me is true, if you really are doing important work that we can't see or verify, then I'm proud of you. But I need you to understand our position. From where we sit, it looks like our daughter is throwing her life away on fantasies. If you can't show us otherwise—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The ultimatum still stood. 2 weeks to prove myself by their standards or face exile from the only family I'd ever known. After she left, I unlocked my screens and dove back into the digital battlefield where my real life existed. Code streams and network traces, encryption algorithms and security protocols. A world where my value is measured not in grade point averages or traditional career markers, but in threats neutralized and disasters prevented. In 10 days, my parents would learn exactly how wrong they'd been about their supposedly failing daughter. But tonight, I had a country to protect, one line of code at a time. The next 3 days passed in a blur of increasingly invasive parental supervision that would have been laughable if it wasn't so infuriating. My parents had apparently decided that their 2-week ultimatum needed immediate enforcement, transforming our house into something resembling a minimum security prison with loving but misguided wardens. It started Tuesday morning when I woke to find my father rifling through my desk drawers. "Looking for something?" I asked from the doorway, watching him examine my external hard drives like they were evidence in a criminal investigation. "Bank statements," he said without embarrassment. "Financial records. Proof of this consulting income you claim to have." He held up one of my encrypted storage devices, turning it over in his hands like it might reveal its secrets through physical inspection. "What's on these?" I said carefully. "Work files. Client data that's protected by confidentiality agreements." "Convenient," Richard muttered, setting the drive back down with obvious frustration. "Everything you do is mysteriously confidential. Every explanation you give us leads to more secrets." What he didn't know was that the device he just handled contained backup files from Operation Blackwater, including communication logs between foreign intelligence operatives and the cybercriminal network we'd been tracking. In the wrong hands, that drive could compromise active federal investigations spanning 3 countries. "Dad, some of those drives contain sensitive information that could what? Expose your video game scores?" He pulled out my bank statements, spreading them across the desk. "Let's talk about real sensitivity. These deposits, irregular amounts from sources listed as consulting services and freelance contracts, no company names, no clear employers. Do you know what this looks like to any reasonable person?" I knew exactly what it looked like. The payment processing for classified government contracts was deliberately obscure, designed to protect both the agencies involved and the contractors working with them. But to someone looking for traditional employment verification, it appeared suspicious at best. "It looks like money laundering," Diane said from behind me. I hadn't heard her approach, but she was there now, joining the impromptu financial investigation. Or drug dealing. Or some other illegal activity that requires hiding income sources. The accusation hit like a physical blow. My own parents, standing in my bedroom, suggesting I was a criminal because they couldn't understand the legitimate but classified nature of my work. "You think I'm dealing drugs?" I asked, incredulous. "We think you're lying to us," Richard said bluntly, "about everything. Your income, your work, your responsibilities. We think you've created this elaborate fantasy about being some kind of cyber consultant to avoid admitting that you're failing at life." By Wednesday, they'd escalated to monitoring my communications. I discovered this when I found Diane scrolling through my regular cell phone, not the encrypted one I used for federal work, thankfully, but my personal device that contained enough information to violate what little privacy I had left. "Reading my texts now?" I asked, holding out my hand for the phone. "Trying to understand your life," she replied, reluctantly returning the device. Do you know how many job applications we found evidence of? 0. How many employment-related conversations? None. Instead, we found messages about server configurations and network protocols and encryption methods. Either you're the most dedicated hobbyist in the world or you're genuinely delusional about the importance of what you do. The texts she'd read were actually discussions with other cybersecurity professionals about emerging threats and defensive strategies. Conversations that would sound like fantasy to someone outside the field, but represented real collaboration on real problems affecting real infrastructure. Mom, if you found messages about medical procedures and pharmaceutical compounds, would you assume I was pretending to be a doctor, or would you consider that I might actually work in healthcare? If you were a doctor, there would be medical licenses, hospital affiliations, malpractice insurance. There would be verifiable credentials and professional associations. She crossed her arms, unmoved by the analogy. Show us one piece of official documentation that proves you work in cybersecurity, one professional reference, one employer who can confirm your employment. The impossibility of her request was maddening. The whole point of classified work was that it couldn't be verified through normal channels. References required security clearances, employers operated under cover identities, professional associations didn't exist for work that officially didn't happen. Thursday brought the most intrusive violation yet. I returned from a brief trip to the secure facility downtown. Officially, I'd told them I was going to the library, to find both parents in my room with my laptop. We're having it examined, Richard announced without preamble. Gerald Morrison from my firm has a son who works in IT. He's going to tell us exactly what's on this computer and whether any of your claims about professional work are legitimate. My blood turned to ice. They had my laptop. The one I used for personal tasks, yes, but also the one that contained cached access credentials and residual traces of connections to federal systems. If someone with basic IT knowledge started digging through browser histories and network logs, they might stumble across evidence that could compromise ongoing operations. You can't do that, I said, reaching for the laptop. Diane stepped between us. It's our house, and we have every right to understand what our daughter is doing under our roof. If you're really doing legitimate work, this examination will prove it. If you're living in fantasy land, it's time you faced reality. Dad, please. I tried to keep my voice calm despite the panic rising in my chest. Some of the data on that computer is protected by federal privacy laws. If someone without proper clearance accesses it... More fantasy, he cut me off. More convenient excuses. Gerald's son has worked with corporate networks for 15 years. If there's real professional work on this computer, he'll recognize it. They left me standing in my room, staring at the empty space where my laptop had been. Within an hour, someone with no security clearance would be examining a device that contained traces of classified communications. Even if the most sensitive data was encrypted beyond his ability to crack, the very existence of certain connection logs could raise questions that would eventually reach the wrong people. I had two choices. Let my parents' IT expert potentially compromise federal investigations, or break my cover to stop him. I chose a third option. From my secure phone, I sent an emergency message to Agent Price. Compromised device. Civilian examination imminent. Request immediate intervention authority. The response came within minutes. Stand by. Director authorizing containment protocol. 20 minutes later, my father's phone rang. The conversation was brief, professional, and transformative. Mr. Roswell, this is Agent Jennifer Walsh from the FBI's Sacramento field office. We understand you're in possession of a computer device that may contain materials related to an ongoing federal investigation. We're going to need you to suspend any examination of that device and surrender it to federal custody immediately.
I watched from the top of the stairs as my father's face went through several changes of color. His confident authority crumbled as Agent Walsh explained that interfering with the device could constitute obstruction of justice, and that agents would arrive within the hour to retrieve it.
But, but it's my daughter's laptop, he stammered into the phone. She lives in our house. We just wanted to understand. Whatever Agent Walsh said next made him sit down heavily in his chair. When the call ended, both of my parents looked up at me with expressions I'd never seen before. Not disappointment or frustration, but something approaching fear. The certainty they'd held about my failures had just been shaken by a phone call from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "Alexis," Diane's voice was barely above a whisper. "Why is the FBI interested in your computer?" I came down the stairs slowly, meeting their eyes with a calmness I didn't entirely feel. Because some of the work I do is more important than you realized. The laptop was returned to me 3 hours later by Agent Walsh herself, who apologized for the inconvenience and reminded me about updated security protocols for working with sensitive materials in civilian environments. My parents watched the entire exchange from the living room window, their faces pale with the dawning realization that their supposedly failing daughter might not be who they thought she was. But they still didn't know the half of it. The FBI laptop incident changed the dynamic in our house, but not in the way I'd hoped. Instead of recognizing that they might have misjudged me, my parents seemed to interpret the federal intervention as confirmation that I was involved in something dangerous. The fear in their eyes had transformed into a different kind of determination, not to save me from failure, but to save me from whatever trouble they believed I'd gotten myself into. Friday morning, I found them in the kitchen with a new folder, this one thicker than their previous collection of evidence. Richard looked up as I entered, his expression grave, in the way it got when he was preparing for difficult legal negotiations. "We've been doing research," he announced, sliding a stack of printed articles across the table, "about cybercrime, about young people who get recruited into illegal hacking operations, about federal investigations that target victims as much as perpetrators." I scanned the headlines: college dropout sentenced for anonymous hacking ring participation. FBI raids target young cybercriminals. When teens turn to the dark web, a parent's nightmare. "You think I'm a cybercriminal?" I said, setting the articles down carefully. "We think you're in over your head," Diane corrected. "We think someone has convinced you that what you're doing is legitimate consulting when it's actually illegal activity, and now the FBI is involved, which means you could be facing serious federal charges." The irony was so complete it was almost artistic. They'd assembled evidence to prove I was a criminal mastermind when I was actually working to stop criminal masterminds. Their research into cybercrime had led them to exactly the wrong conclusion about my role in fighting it. What if I told you that sometimes the FBI investigates people because they want to work with them, not because they want to arrest them? Richard's expression didn't change. "Alexis, federal agents don't protect criminals' computer equipment. They confiscate it. The fact that they returned your laptop suggests you're cooperating with an investigation, which means you either witnessed crimes or participated in them." This was the moment I realized that conventional explanations weren't going to work. My parents had constructed a narrative that explained all the evidence they could see, and that narrative cast me as either a victim or a perpetrator of cybercrime. They weren't going to believe the truth because the truth was too far outside their understanding of how the world worked. So I stopped trying to convince them and started documenting everything instead. I began with their research folder, photographing each article and noting the date they compiled their evidence of my supposed criminal activity. I documented their conversations about contacting lawyers to represent me in federal court, their discussions about intervention specialists who worked with families affected by cybercrime, their plans to stage what they called a reality intervention to force me to admit my involvement in illegal activities. Every misguided attempt to save me from crimes I wasn't committing became part of a record I was building. Not for legal purposes. I wasn't planning to sue my own parents, but because I was starting to understand that this situation was going to require more than simple explanations when the truth finally came out. That evening, while they attended their Friday night book club, I made a series of encrypted calls that would change everything. "Agent Price, it's Roswell. I need to discuss my operational security status." What's your concern? My family situation has become untenable. My parents now believe I'm involved in cybercrime and are planning legal interventions that could compromise my cover identity. There was a pause while Price processed this information. Are you requesting extraction from your current living situation?
Negative. I'm requesting authorization to expand my documentation of this situation for potential future briefing purposes. Explain. I outlined the escalating misunderstandings, the FBI laptop incident, and my parents' current theory that I was cooperating with federal investigators as either a victim or reformed criminal. If this continues escalating, we may need to consider limited disclosure to prevent them from taking actions that could actually compromise ongoing operations. You're talking about briefing civilians on classified activities. I'm talking about preventing civilians from interfering with classified activities because they don't understand what they're interfering with. Another pause. Hold for Director Hartwell. The transfer took less than 30 seconds, but when Director Hartwell's voice came through the encrypted line, I felt the weight of federal authority that my parents still couldn't comprehend. Agent Roswell, I understand you're dealing with a family situation that's affecting operational security. Yes, sir. My parents have misinterpreted federal involvement as evidence of criminal activity on my part. They're planning interventions that could draw unwanted attention to my work. What's your recommendation? I took a breath, knowing that what I was about to propose would change my relationship with my family forever. I recommend preparing a limited disclosure briefing that explains my role without compromising specific operations. If they continue on their current path, they're going to force a confrontation that could be much more damaging than controlled disclosure. Understood. I'll have our family liaison team prepare a contingency briefing. But Agent Roswell, this is a significant step. Once your family knows about your federal work, there's no going back to your current cover. Sir, with respect, my current cover is already blown. They just don't understand what they've discovered. Very well. Stand by for further instructions. And Agent Roswell, your work on Operation Blackwater was exemplary. We neutralized the threat 2 hours ahead of schedule. Your algorithms prevented what could have been the largest intelligence breach in modern history. After the call ended, I sat in my room looking at the photos I'd taken of my parents' research, their articles about cybercriminals and federal investigations. In their attempt to understand their daughter, they'd built a case file that painted me as everything I worked to stop. The next morning, I found them preparing for what Diane called the conversation. They'd arranged chairs in the living room like a counseling session with printed materials about legal representation and family therapy for cybercrime situations. Alexis, we need you to be honest with us, Richard began, his voice carrying the gravity of a courtroom. We know you're involved with the FBI. We know your computer contains materials they consider important. We've researched the kinds of situations that lead to federal investigation of young people's computer activities. I looked at their earnest faces, their careful preparation, their absolute certainty that they were about to save me from a life of crime. You're right, I said quietly. I am involved with the FBI. Relief flooded their expressions. Finally, they thought, their daughter was going to tell them the truth. But not in the way you think. The relief flickered, replaced with wariness. What I do with computers isn't illegal. It's not criminal cooperation or witness testimony or reformed hacker consultation. I met both their eyes steadily. What I do is stop the people your articles are written about. I'm one of the good guys. Diane shook her head. Alexis, federal agents don't recruit college dropouts to fight cybercrime. They hire people with degrees in computer science and law enforcement backgrounds. What if I told you that the most dangerous cyber threats come from people who learned their skills outside traditional education systems? What if I told you that sometimes the best way to catch unconventional criminals is with unconventional investigators? Richard leaned forward. Are you claiming to be some kind of undercover federal agent?
I'm claiming that the work I do is more important than either of you has ever imagined, and that in 72 hours, you're going to understand exactly how wrong you've been about your supposedly failing daughter. I stood up, leaving them in their intervention setup with their articles about cybercriminals and their plans to save me from crimes I'd never committed. In 3 days, everything would change. But first, I had to finish building the case that would show them who I really was. Over the weekend, I did something that completely baffled my parents. I started acting like the failure they believed me to be. Saturday morning, instead of my usual early start working on encrypted systems, I slept until noon. When I finally emerged from my room, I wandered into the kitchen wearing pajamas and asked if there was any cereal left. The look of confused disappointment on Diane's face was almost comical. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked, studying me like I might be running a fever. "Just tired," I said, pouring milk over generic cornflakes. "All this stress about finding a job and figuring out my life. Maybe you're right. Maybe I have been living in Fantasyland." Richard looked up from his newspaper, eyebrows raised. This was not the defiant daughter who'd been insisting her computer work was legitimate federal consulting. This was someone who sounded defeated.
"Does this mean you're ready to consider our suggestions?" he asked, carefully, as if sudden agreement might be a trap. I shrugged, a gesture of apparent resignation that I'd practiced in the mirror. "I guess I don't have much choice. The FBI thing was probably just some mistake anyway. Wrong person, wrong computer, whatever." Over the next 2 days, I played the role of the reformed prodigal daughter with Academy Award precision. I picked up job applications from 3 retail stores in town. I researched community college programs for practical degrees like business administration and dental hygiene. I even made an appointment with Dr. Patricia Wine, the career counselor they'd insisted I see. The transformation was so complete that by Sunday evening, my parents were exchanging relieved glances across the dinner table. "I'm proud of you for taking this seriously," Diane said, refilling my water glass with the kind of maternal attention she'd withheld during our recent conflicts. "It takes maturity to admit when you've been heading in the wrong direction." "Sometimes we all need a reality check," I agreed, cutting my pot roast into neat pieces. "I think I was just afraid to admit that the computer stuff wasn't going anywhere. It's easier to pretend you're doing important work than to face the fact that you're not qualified for anything." Richard nodded approvingly. "The first step towards real success is honest self-assessment. You're finally showing the kind of judgment we've been hoping to see." What they didn't know was that while I was playing the part of the chastened daughter, I was also conducting the most intensive documentation project of my career. Every conversation was recorded through my encrypted phone. Every assumption they made about my supposed reformation was logged with timestamps and context. Every moment of their growing confidence in their parental intervention was preserved for posterity. Because I knew something they didn't. In exactly 68 hours, Director Hartwell would be calling their house. Monday morning brought the career counseling appointment with Dr. Wine, a woman in her 50s who'd built a practice helping young people find their way after what she euphemistically called difficult transitions. Her office was decorated with motivational posters about goal setting and personal responsibility. The kind of environment designed to make confused 20-somethings feel both hopeful and slightly ashamed of their previous choices. "So, Alexis," Dr. Wine began, reviewing notes my mother had apparently provided in advance, "your parents tell me you've been struggling with some unrealistic career expectations." I guess I thought I was better at computers than I actually am. I convinced myself I was doing important consulting work, but it was probably just, I don't know, wishful thinking. Dr. Wine nodded knowingly. "It's very common for young people with technical hobbies to overestimate their professional value. The technology industry is extremely competitive, and it requires formal education and certifications that can't be replaced by self-taught skills." I bit my tongue to prevent myself from mentioning that I'd helped design some of the certification standards she was referring to. The good news, she continued, is that recognizing these limitations is the first step towards finding a realistic career path. Have you considered medical administration? It involves computer work, but in a structured environment with clear advancement opportunities. For the next hour, I listened to Dr. Wine explain why my computer hobby wasn't suitable for professional work, why self-directed learning couldn't replace formal education, and why young people often developed grandiose fantasies about their abilities to avoid facing real-world responsibilities. Every condescending word was being recorded for a highlight reel I was mentally compiling. I think we've made real progress today, Dr. Wine concluded, scheduling follow-up appointments for the next month. Your parents should be very pleased with your newfound willingness to pursue practical goals. That evening, Richard and Diane were practically glowing with satisfaction. Their intervention had worked. Their stubborn, delusional daughter had finally seen reason. Dr. Wine called this afternoon, Diane reported over dinner. She said you showed remarkable insight and maturity. She thinks you could be very successful in healthcare administration or business support roles. He mentioned that you seemed genuinely interested in learning practical skills instead of chasing impossible dreams. This is exactly the kind of attitude adjustment we've been hoping to see. I nodded earnestly. I think I was just scared to admit that I wasn't as smart as I thought I was. It's embarrassing when you realize you've been living in a fantasy. They exchanged the kind of satisfied parent look that said, "Finally, our child is learning life lessons." What made the performance particularly satisfying was watching them relax their vigilance. The constant monitoring of my activities stopped. The suspicious examination of my communications ended. They stopped treating me like a potential criminal and started treating me like a reformed daughter who had finally accepted their wisdom. "We've decided to extend your deadline," Richard announced Tuesday evening. "Since you're making such genuine progress, we think it would be premature to force you out before you've had time to establish yourself in a new direction."
That's very generous, I said, and meant it, though not for the reasons they assumed. "We want you to succeed, Alexis," Diane said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "We've always wanted that. We just needed you to want realistic success instead of impossible dreams." Tuesday night, I lay in bed listening to them discuss my transformation in voices that carried genuine relief. They'd saved their daughter from a life of delusion. They'd successfully guided me toward practical goals and realistic expectations. Their parenting had finally achieved the breakthrough they'd been working toward. In 36 hours, they would discover that everything they thought they'd accomplished was an illusion, that their delusional daughter had been playing chess while they thought she was learning checkers, that the impossible dreams they'd talked her out of were actually accomplishments they couldn't have imagined. But for now, I let them enjoy their victory, because the bigger the satisfaction they felt in their successful intervention, the more profound their shock would be when Director Hartwell introduced himself and explained exactly who their daughter really was. The countdown was almost over, and when it reached 0, the conversation would shift from their disappointment in my failures to their amazement at successes they'd never understood. Some lessons, I'd learned, were best taught through experience rather than explanation. Wednesday morning arrived with an encrypted message that made my carefully maintained facade of defeat almost impossible to sustain. Director Hartwell's office had finalized the family briefing protocols. In 18 hours, Agent Rachel Sterling from the FBI's Family Liaison Division would arrive at our house to conduct what the federal government called a limited operational disclosure to civilian family members. The message included a 20-page briefing packet that outlined exactly what my parents would learn: my security clearance level, the nature of my federal consulting work, a sanitized overview of operations I'd contributed to, and testimonials from senior officials about my value to national security.
Reading through it felt surreal, seeing my accomplishments laid out in official federal letterhead, my contributions to cybersecurity quantified in terms my parents might actually understand. But first, I had one more performance to give. I joined my parents for breakfast wearing the retail uniform from Harper's department store, where I was supposed to start my new, realistic job the following week. The polyester vest and name tag represented everything they thought I should aspire to. Honest work, humble expectations, acceptance of my limitations. "You look very professional," Diane said, approvingly, adjusting my collar with maternal pride. "This is exactly the kind of fresh start you need." "I'm nervous," I admitted, which was true, though not about folding sweaters and operating cash registers. What if I'm not good at normal jobs either? Richard looked up from his coffee with the kind of gentle authority he used when dispensing life lessons. "Alexis, the difference between this job and your computer fantasies is that retail work has clear expectations and measurable results. You'll know exactly what success looks like." If only he knew that my measurable results included preventing cyber attacks on critical infrastructure and helping trace international criminal networks. But I nodded like his advice was profound wisdom. "Dr. Wynn called yesterday," Diane reported, buttering her toast with satisfaction. "She wants to schedule a follow-up session to discuss your progress. She's very optimistic about your attitude adjustment." The irony was delicious. Dr. Wynn, who'd spent an hour explaining why self-taught computer skills were worthless, would soon learn that her reformed patient held security clearances that required congressional oversight. "I should probably go," I said, gathering my purse and car keys. Instead of driving to Harper's department store, I went to the federal building downtown for what would be my final classified briefing before everything changed. Agent Price met me in the secure conference room where we'd planned dozens of operations over the past 2 years. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, reviewing the family disclosure documentation. "Once we brief your parents, your current living situation will never be the same." "It's already not the same," I pointed out. "They think I'm a reformed cybercriminal who's finally accepted reality. This can't be more complicated than that." Agent Sterling arrived shortly after. A woman in her 40s whose entire career involved explaining classified work to confused family members. She had the patient demeanor of someone who'd delivered shocking news to countless parents, spouses, and children who'd discovered their loved ones weren't who they appeared to be. "I've reviewed your situation," she said, spreading files across the conference table. "Your parents believe you're unemployed, directionless, and recently reformed from criminal activity. Is that accurate?" "That's their current understanding, yes. And they have no idea about your security clearance, your consulting work, or your contributions to federal cybersecurity?" "None whatsoever."
She walked me through the disclosure protocol, initial introduction and credential verification, overview of my security clearance and federal consulting role, summary of significant operations I'd contributed to, and finally, testimonials from senior officials about my professional value. The entire briefing was designed to systematically dismantle every assumption my parents had made about their supposedly failing daughter. "We'll conclude with Director Hartwell's personal commendation for your work on Operation Blackwater," Agent Sterling explained. "He specifically requested that your parents understand the national security significance of what you prevented." That evening, I returned home still wearing my retail uniform, playing my role until the very end. My parents were in the living room, reading real estate magazines and discussing their post-intervention success. "How was your first day?" Diane asked with genuine maternal interest. "Educational," I said, which was true in ways she couldn't imagine. I learned a lot about expectations. The important thing is that you're building real skills in a real job. No more chasing impossible dreams or pretending to be something you're not. I excused myself to change clothes, knowing it would be the last time I'd wear the costume of their reformed daughter. Tomorrow, everything would be different. My secure phone buzzed with final coordination details. Agent Sterling would arrive at 2 p.m. Director Hartwell would participate via secure video link.
The briefing was expected to last approximately 90 minutes, including time for questions and emotional processing. I looked around my childhood bedroom, taking in the homework awards and science fair ribbons that had once made my parents proud. Tomorrow, they'd learn that their daughter hadn't stopped achieving. She'd just started achieving things too important for them to see. The career counseling appointment with Dr. Wynn was scheduled for Friday. I wondered if she'd want to reschedule after learning that her patient held top-secret clearance and had been personally commended by the FBI director for preventing the largest intelligence breach in modern history. The retail job at Harper's department store was supposed to start Monday. I'd have to call in and explain that my schedule had some conflicts related to national security consulting work. That night, I sat at my desk writing what would be my final encrypted report before the disclosure. Tomorrow, there would be no more hiding my real work from my family. No more pretending that preventing cyber attacks was just a hobby. No more career counselors explaining why self-taught skills couldn't lead to meaningful work. The foundation they'd built their disappointment on, their certainty that I was a failure who'd finally seen reason, was about to be systematically demolished by federal agents with briefing materials that told a very different story. I'd spent weeks documenting their misunderstandings, recording their condescending advice, preserving their satisfaction in my supposed reformation. Tomorrow, all of that documentation would become a time capsule of the last moments before they learned who their daughter really was. Some parents worried that their children would never amount to anything. Mine were about to discover that their biggest concern should have been that they never understood what their daughter had already become. The countdown was almost over. In 16 hours, Agent Sterling would knock on our door, and the conversation would shift from their pride in fixing their failure of a daughter to their shock at learning she'd been succeeding beyond their wildest comprehension all along. Thursday morning arrived with an atmosphere I hadn't experienced in weeks. My parents were actually happy. They hummed while making breakfast, exchanged satisfied glances across the kitchen table, and spoke about me in terms they hadn't used since high school graduation. Their intervention had worked. Their stubborn, delusional daughter had finally accepted reality and was building a respectable life. "Harper's called this morning to confirm your schedule," Diane reported, checking items off a list she'd made of my new responsibilities. "Full training shifts Thursday through Sunday, then regular part-time hours starting next week. Mrs. Patterson said she saw you leaving early yesterday and was impressed by how professional you looked." The neighbors were already being recruited as witnesses to my transformation. In small-town fashion, my parents apparently had shared news of my reformation with anyone who'd listen. Their daughter was finally on the right track. "I'm proud of how you've handled this transition," Richard said, folding his newspaper with the satisfied air of a man whose parenting had achieved its intended results. "It takes character to admit when you've been wrong about your direction in life." I nodded, maintaining the humble gratitude they expected, while mentally counting down the hours until Agent Sterling's arrival. 6 hours and 12 minutes until everything changed. But the first crack in their confidence appeared unexpectedly, in the form of a phone call that came while I was supposedly getting ready for my retail training shift. The house phone rang at 9:47 a.m. Diane answered with her typical cheerful greeting, but her expression changed within seconds. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that? You're calling from where?" I paused at the top of the stairs, listening. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation?" Diane's voice carried a note of alarm that cut through the morning's contentment like a knife. There was a long pause while she listened to whoever was on the other end. Her face went through several expressions: confusion, concern, and something that looked like the beginning of panic. "I see. Yes, 2 p.m. would be... Yes, we'll be here. Do we need a lawyer?" Another pause. Richard had abandoned his newspaper and was watching his wife with growing alarm. "I understand. Yes. We'll make sure Alexis is here as well. Thank you." She hung up the phone and stood staring at it like it might ring again with an explanation that made more sense. "Who was that?" Richard demanded. "Agent Rachel Sterling from the FBI. She's coming here this afternoon for what she called a family briefing about Alexis."
The color drained from Richard's face. A family briefing? What kind of family briefing? She wouldn't say much over the phone, just that they need to discuss Alexis's, she called it her federal involvement with us. Federal involvement. The phrase hung in the air between them like a bomb waiting to explode. This doesn't make sense, Richard said, beginning to pace the kitchen. If she were in serious trouble, they would have arrested her by now. If she were cooperating with an investigation, they would have explained that when they took her computer. Maybe they did arrest her, Diane whispered. Maybe she's been lying to us about going to job training. Maybe she's been in federal custody and we didn't know. Don't be ridiculous. She's been sleeping in her room every night. She had breakfast with us this morning. But doubt was creeping into his voice. The certainty that had characterized their recent conversations about my reformation was beginning to crack. I came downstairs wearing my Harper's uniform, car keys in hand, playing the role of the dutiful daughter heading to honest work. "Everything okay?" I asked, noting their pale faces on the tension that had replaced their morning contentment. "The FBI called," Diane said bluntly. "They're coming here this afternoon to discuss your federal involvement." "What federal involvement, Alexis?" I paused, letting confusion cross my face. "I have no idea. Maybe it's about the computer thing from last week? I thought that was resolved." They specifically said they need to brief us about your involvement. Not ask questions, not investigate. Brief us. Richard's legal training was kicking in, analyzing language for hidden meanings. That suggests ongoing activity, not resolved matters. "Maybe they made a mistake," I suggested weakly. "Wrong person? Similar name?" But even as I said it, I could see them running through the evidence they'd been ignoring. The irregular income sources, the expensive computer equipment, the technical conversations they'd overheard, the FBI's protection of my laptop, the mysterious work that kept me up all night. "Alexis," Diane's voice was carefully controlled. "We need you to tell us the truth, right now, before the FBI agent gets here. What exactly is your relationship with federal law enforcement?" This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the first crack in their certainty about who I was and what I'd been doing. But I couldn't reveal everything yet. The disclosure had to come from official sources, in official ways, with official documentation that would prevent them from dismissing it as another fantasy. "I honestly don't know what they want to tell you," I said, which was technically true. While I knew the general content of the briefing, I didn't know exactly how Agent Sterling would present the information. But maybe there are things about my work that I couldn't explain because of legal restrictions. "Legal restrictions?" Richard seized on the phrase. "What kind of legal restrictions?" "The kind that come with security clearances and federal consulting contracts," I said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. They stared at me like I'd just claimed to be a space alien. "Security clearances?" Diane's voice was barely a whisper. "Alexis, people with security clearances don't fail out of college. They don't work retail jobs. They don't live with their parents while struggling to find direction." "What if," I said carefully, "those things were cover for work that couldn't be discussed publicly?" "Cover?" Richard's lawyer instincts were fully engaged now. "Are you saying you've been living a fake life to hide real federal work?" "I'm saying that at 2 p.m., Agent Sterling will explain things I haven't been allowed to explain myself." They exchanged a look that contained volumes of communication, doubt, fear, the beginning of understanding that everything they thought they knew about their daughter might be wrong. "You need to call Harper's. Tell them you can't come in today." "Mom, I can't just skip my second day of training because—" "Alexis," Richard's voice carried the authority of someone who just realized he might be completely out of his depth. "If federal agents are coming to our house to brief us about your work, retail training is not your priority." I called Harper's and explained that a family emergency would prevent me from attending training. The manager was understanding, offering to reschedule for the following week. As I hung up, I caught my parents watching me with expressions I'd never seen before. Not disappointment or frustration, but something approaching awe mixed with fear. If what you're suggesting is true, Diane said slowly, then we've been...
Wrong, Richard finished. Completely wrong about everything. The next 4 hours passed in a surreal suspension of normal family dynamics. My parents couldn't quite believe what I'd implied, but they couldn't dismiss it either. They alternated between asking careful questions I couldn't fully answer and sitting in stunned silence as they reconsidered every assumption they'd made about my life. At 1:55 p.m., a black sedan pulled into our driveway. Agent Sterling emerged carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of professional attire that instantly communicated federal authority. My parents stood at the living room window, watching her approach with expressions of people about to learn that their understanding of reality had been fundamentally flawed. "She looks very official," Diane whispered. "They all do," Richard replied grimly. The doorbell rang, and with it, the last moments of my parents' certainty about their supposedly reformed failure of a daughter came to an end. Agent Sterling entered our house with the practiced efficiency of someone who delivered life-changing news to dozens of families. She was tall, impeccably dressed, and carried herself with an authority that immediately commanded respect. More importantly, she wore the kind of federal credentials that made my parents' previous certainty about my failures seem suddenly fragile. "Mr. and Mrs. Roswell," she said, displaying her FBI identification with the smooth precision of someone who'd done this countless times. "I'm Special Agent Rachel Sterling from the Bureau's Family Liaison Division. Thank you for making time to meet with me today." My parents shook her hand with the careful politeness people use when they're not sure whether they're meeting with someone who's about to arrest their daughter or commend her. "Please, have a seat," Richard said, gesturing toward the living room where they'd arranged chairs like a formal conference. We're not entirely sure why you're here." Agent Sterling settled into the chair they'd offered, opening her briefcase with deliberate calm. "I'm here to provide you with information about your daughter's professional relationship with the federal government, information that she hasn't been authorized to share with you until now." The words hung in the air like a revelation waiting to explode. Professional relationship, not criminal investigation, not witness cooperation, not reformed cybercriminal rehabilitation. Professional relationship. "I don't understand," Diane said, her voice carrying the careful control of someone trying not to hope for something that seemed impossible. "Alexis doesn't have a professional relationship with the government. She's been struggling to find direction. We've been helping her get back on track." Agent Sterling pulled out a thick folder, setting it on the coffee table between them. "Mrs. Roswell, your daughter has held top-secret security clearance with the Department of Defense for the past 2 years. She's been contracted as a cybersecurity consultant for multiple federal agencies, including the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and National Security Agency." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. "That's impossible," Richard said finally, his voice hollow. "Top secret clearance requires extensive background checks, education requirements, employment history." "All of which your daughter satisfied," Agent Sterling replied, opening the folder to reveal official documents bearing federal seals and security classifications that my parents had never imagined their supposedly failing daughter could possess. "This is my daughter's security clearance, issued after a comprehensive investigation that included interviews with character references, financial audits, and psychological evaluations." My parents stared at the document like it was written in a foreign language. Their names appeared in the character reference section. They'd been interviewed about me without realizing what the interview was for. "We were contacted by investigators last year," Diane whispered, recognition dawning. "They said they were conducting a routine background check for a government position. We thought it was for some entry-level job application." "It was for this," Agent Sterling said, gesturing at the clearance certificate. "Your daughter was being vetted for work that affects national security." Richard picked up the document with shaking hands, examining the seals and signatures that proved his supposedly directionless daughter held clearances most federal employees never achieved. "But she failed out of college. She has no formal qualifications, no degree, no traditional employment history." Mr. Roswell, some of the most critical cybersecurity work in this country is performed by individuals whose skills can't be measured by traditional academic metrics. Your daughter's abilities were identified through her freelance work stopping cyber attacks on corporate systems. When those attacks turned out to be test runs for assaults on federal infrastructure, she came to our attention. Agent Sterling pulled out another document, a commendation letter signed by Director Hartwell himself. This is a personal letter from Director FBI Jonathan Hartwell acknowledging your daughter's contributions to Operation Blackwater, a classified investigation that prevented what could have been the largest intelligence breach in American history. The words largest intelligence breach in American history seem to echo in the suddenly too small living room.
Our daughter prevented an intelligence breach? Diane's voice was barely audible. Your daughter identified the attack vectors, traced the criminal network's communication protocols, and developed the countermeasures that allowed us to neutralize the threat. Director Hartwell specifically requested that you understand the significance of her contribution. Agent Sterling pulled out her secure tablet, connecting it to a portable screen she'd brought with her. Director Hartwell wanted to speak with you personally about your daughter's work. He's joining us via secure video conference. The screen flickered to life, revealing a man whose face my parents had seen countless times on the news. FBI Director Jonathan Hartwell speaking to them from what was clearly a high-security federal facility. Mr. and Mrs. Roswell. Director Hartwell's voice carried the weight of federal authority. Thank you for taking time to meet with Agent Sterling today. I wanted to personally ensure you understand the value your daughter brings to our national security efforts. My parents sat frozen, staring at the FBI director addressing them by name from a secure government facility. Your daughter, Alexis, has been instrumental in protecting critical American infrastructure from cyber attacks originating from hostile foreign governments. Her work has prevented disasters that would have made international headlines if she hadn't stopped them. Director Hartwell, Richard managed to say, we had no idea. We thought she was failing at everything. Mr. Roswell, your daughter's work requires absolute secrecy. The fact that you were unaware of her contributions is actually a testament to her professionalism. She's maintained operational security even with her own family. But why couldn't she tell us? Diane asked. Why did we have to believe that she was throwing her life away? Because, Mrs. Roswell, the enemies she fights against specifically target the families of people who threaten their operations. Her secrecy wasn't just about protecting classified information, it was about protecting you. The weight of that revelation settled over my parents like a physical force. Their daughter hadn't been hiding her failures from them. She'd been hiding her successes to keep them safe. I need you both to understand something, Director Hartwell continued. Over the next week, we're going to be asking your daughter to take on her most challenging assignment yet. A cyber-terrorist organization has specifically targeted her for elimination because her previous work has cost them millions of dollars and exposed their operations to law enforcement. My parents went completely still. We're implementing enhanced security protocols for your family, effective immediately. Agent Sterling will coordinate with local law enforcement to ensure your safety while Alexis completes this assignment. Are we in danger? Richard asked. You're under federal protection, and it's your daughter that this protection exists. The work she does makes her valuable to us and dangerous to them. Agent Sterling closed the video connection, leaving my parents staring at a blank screen that had just connected them to the highest levels of federal law enforcement. 7 days. Your daughter has 7 days to complete an assignment that will determine whether this terrorist network continues operating or gets dismantled permanently. She stood, gathering her materials with professional efficiency. During those 7 days, you'll be under discreet federal surveillance. Your daughter will be working from a secure facility. And when it's over, you'll understand exactly why the FBI director calls her Sir when he needs her help. After Agent Sterling left, my parents sat in their living room surrounded by official documents that proved their supposedly failing daughter was actually succeeding at levels they never imagined possible. The countdown had begun. 7 days until I completed the most important assignment of my career. 7 days until my parents fully understood that the daughter they tried to save from failure was actually one of the people protecting the country they lived in. The only question now was whether I'd survive long enough to see the look on their faces when it was all over. The first 24 hours after Agent Sterling's briefing were unlike anything our family had ever experienced. My parents moved through the house like people recovering from a profound shock, picking up familiar objects and staring at them as if they'd never seen these things before. The coffee mug Diane had used every morning for 15 years, the newspaper Richard read religiously, the family photos that lined the mantel. Everything looked the same, but everything meant something completely different now. They kept trying to apologize, but couldn't seem to find words adequate for the magnitude of their misunderstanding. "We thought we were helping you," Diane said Friday morning, staring at the retail uniform I'd never have to wear again. "We thought we were saving you from wasting your life." "We had no idea," Richard added, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality had been shattered. "No idea that while we were lecturing you about responsibility, you were protecting the country." But their shock quickly transformed into something more complex, desperate attempts to rationalize what they'd learned and find some way to maintain their parental authority in a situation that had revealed how little they actually understood about their own daughter.
Friday afternoon brought the first of what I would later think of as their last stands, frantic phone calls to anyone they thought might provide a different perspective on the impossible situation they found themselves in. "I'm calling Gerald Morrison," Richard announced, pulling out his phone with the determined air of someone who'd found a solution. "He's worked government contracts for 20 years. He'll know if this is legitimate." I watched from the kitchen doorway as he dialed, his confidence returning slightly as he prepared to consult an expert who would surely explain away the federal documents that had turned his world upside down. "Gerald? It's Richard Roswell. I need to ask you about something confidential." "Yes, about government work." "No, not for me, for Alexis." The conversation lasted 15 minutes. I could hear Gerald's voice through the phone, growing more excited as Richard described my security clearance and federal consulting work. When Richard hung up, his face had gone pale again. "What did he say?" Diane asked. "He said that top secret clearance with multiple agencies is extremely rare. He said it usually takes years to achieve that level of access, and the background investigations are more thorough than anything he's ever experienced. He said..." Richard paused, struggling with the words. "He said that if Alexis really has that clearance, she's probably one of the most valuable cybersecurity specialists in the country. But instead of accepting this confirmation, they doubled down on finding alternative explanations." Saturday brought Dr. Patricia Wynn's emergency house call. Diane had called her in a panic, asking her to come assess whether the federal briefing represented some kind of elaborate psychological manipulation or coercion. "Sometimes young people with technical skills get recruited into situations they don't fully understand," Dr. Wynn explained, setting up in our living room like she was conducting an intervention. "Government agencies have been known to exploit civilians, especially vulnerable individuals who are struggling with identity and direction." I sat quietly while she outlined her theory, that I'd been manipulated by federal agents who'd taken advantage of my academic struggles and family conflicts to recruit me into dangerous work I wasn't qualified to handle. "The pattern fits," she continued, consulting notes she'd apparently prepared overnight. "Isolation from family, secrecy about activities, involvement with law enforcement, irregular income sources. These are classic indicators of someone being exploited by criminal organizations masquerading as legitimate government work." "But we saw the FBI director," Diane protested weakly. "On video, he knew her name, knew her work." "Technology today makes it very easy to fake official communications," Dr. Wynn replied with the confidence of someone who'd found an explanation that restored her professional credibility. "Identity theft rings often create elaborate scenarios to convince families that their loved ones are involved in legitimate activities." The sheer determination to avoid accepting the obvious truth was breathtaking. Rather than admit they'd completely misjudged their daughter, they were willing to believe that the FBI director himself was part of an elaborate scam targeting cybersecurity college dropouts. Sunday brought the most desperate attempt yet.
Richard's decision to contact his law firm's investigative services to verify my federal employment. I'm hiring a private investigator, someone independent who can confirm whether these federal claims are legitimate or whether Alexis has been victimized by some kind of sophisticated fraud. The investigator, Marcus Daniels, arrived Sunday afternoon with the kind of equipment and credentials that suggested he took government verification seriously. He spent 3 hours examining the documents Agent Sterling had provided, making phone calls to federal agencies, and conducting what he called independent confirmation of classified employment status. I watched my parents' faces as Daniels delivered his report. Mr. and Mrs. Roswell, your daughter's federal employment is not only legitimate, but extraordinarily rare. I've worked at government investigations for 12 years, and I've never seen someone her age with this level of security access. The clearances alone represent months of investigation and millions of dollars in background verification. But surely someone could fake these documents, create false federal identification, impersonate officials. Daniels looked at him with the patient expression of a professional who'd encountered desperate clients before. Sir, I've examined forgeries and fraudulent federal documentation for over a decade. These aren't fake. I personally called the FBI's verification hotline and confirmed your daughter's current active status as a cybersecurity consultant. The person who answered the phone knew her by name and immediately transferred me to a supervisor who confirmed her involvement in classified operations. That's impossible, Diane whispered. Our daughter was failing college. She was directionless. She was living in fantasy land. Mrs. Roswell, your daughter was maintaining cover while working on assignments that affect national security. What appeared to be failure was actually professionalism at the highest level. That evening, as Daniels packed up his equipment and left my parents with yet another confirmation of my federal employment, I found them sitting in the living room staring at the documents that had destroyed their understanding of their own daughter. We've been such fools, Richard said finally. While we were treating you like a failure, you were saving the country.
We've wasted so much time, Diane added, tears beginning to flow. Time we could have been proud of you instead of disappointed. Time we could have supported you instead of trying to fix something that wasn't broken. But even as they expressed regret, I could see them still struggling with the fundamental shift in family dynamics. For 24 years, they'd been the successful parents, guiding their struggling daughter. Now they were discovering that their daughter had been succeeding at levels they'd never imagined, while they'd been offering advice about retail careers and realistic expectations. Monday morning brought a call that ended their desperate attempts to find alternative explanations. Agent Sterling, checking in before my departure for the secure facility where I'd spend the next 6 days, completing the assignment Director Hartwell had described. Mr. and Mrs. Roswell, the security detail will remain in place while your daughter is working. You'll notice increased patrol presence in your neighborhood and some federal vehicles parked nearby. This is standard protocol when family members of high-value assets are under protection. High-value assets. Their supposedly failing daughter was a high-value asset whose family required federal protection while she worked on assignments that could determine national security outcomes. After the call, they sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that there were no alternative explanations, no conspiracy theories, no sophisticated frauds that could account for the federal resources being deployed to protect them while their daughter did work they still couldn't fully comprehend. 6 days, Diane said quietly. She's going to be gone for 6 days working on something so dangerous that we need federal protection? And when she comes back, Richard added, we're going to have to figure out how to be parents to someone whose work is more important than anything we've ever done. As I packed my equipment for the secure facility, I could hear them downstairs, trying to call relatives and friends to explain why federal agents would be monitoring their house for the next week. Every conversation was the same. Shocked silence on the other end of the line as they tried to explain that their supposedly failing daughter was actually protecting national security.
The last stand was over. There were no more alternative explanations to explore, no more experts to consult, no more ways to avoid accepting that they'd been fundamentally wrong about everything. In 6 days, when I returned from completing the most dangerous assignment of my career, they'd have to face the final reality. Their daughter hadn't just succeeded despite their lack of faith in her. She'd succeeded while protecting them from consequences they'd never imagined. The countdown continued. 6 days until they learned whether the daughter they'd tried to save from failure would survive the work that proved she'd never been failing at all. Tuesday morning, a convoy of black SUVs arrived at our house at exactly 6 a.m. I watched from my bedroom window as federal agents emerged with the kind of equipment that made it clear this wasn't a routine consultation. Portable servers, satellite communication arrays, and devices I recognized as military-grade encryption hardware. The mission that would define my career was about to begin. Agent Price knocked on the front door precisely as I finished packing my secure equipment. My parents had been awake since 5 a.m., hovering nervously in the kitchen, like people waiting for surgery results. Agent Roswell, Price greeted me with the professional respect that still seemed to bewilder my parents. The secure facility is ready. Director Hartwell will brief you personally upon arrival. Through the living room window, I could see neighbors beginning to notice the federal presence on our quiet suburban street. Mrs. Patterson was peering through her curtains at the communications van that had parked across from her garden. Mr. Chen from 2 houses down was pretending to get his morning newspaper while obviously photographing the government vehicles. "How long will she be gone?" Diane asked Agent Price, her voice carrying the careful control of someone trying not to sound afraid. 6 days maximum. Possibly less if the operation concludes ahead of schedule. You'll be contacted immediately when it's safe for Agent Roswell to return home. Agent Roswell. Even hearing my federal designation spoken aloud in my childhood living room felt surreal. "And we'll be protected while she's gone?" Richard asked. "Mr. Roswell, your family is now under the same security protocols we use for federal judges and cabinet members. The threat level is real, but so is our protection." I hugged my parents goodbye, noting how different the gesture felt now that they understood why I might not come back. Diane held on longer than usual, whispering, "Be safe," with an intensity that contained months of unspoken fear. "I'll see you when it's over," I promised, though we all knew that wasn't guaranteed.
The secure facility was located 40 miles outside the city, in a complex that didn't appear on any public maps. As our convoy approached the checkpoint, I saw why my parents had needed 6 months of federal protection preparation. Guard towers, razor wire, and detection systems that could identify threats from miles away. This wasn't just a government building. It was a fortress designed to protect the country's most critical cybersecurity operations. Director Hartwell met me in the Central Command Center, a room that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Wall-to-wall screens displayed data streams from around the world, with analysts monitoring cyber threats in real time. "Agent Roswell," he greeted me, shaking hands with the firm grip of someone who understood the gravity of what we were about to attempt. "Are you ready to end this?" The threat we were facing had been building for 18 months. A cyber-terrorist organization called Digital Storm had been systematically attacking American infrastructure, probing for weaknesses they could exploit in a coordinated assault that would cripple power grids, financial systems, and communication networks simultaneously. They'd specifically targeted me for elimination because my previous work had cost them millions of dollars and exposed their European operations to international law enforcement. "They know you're here," Director Hartwell explained, pointing to intercepts our intelligence teams had gathered. "They know you're the primary threat to their final operation. They've offered a $10 million bounty for information about your location." $10 million. More money than most people saw in a lifetime, offered for my capture or elimination. The good news, he continued, is that their desperation to stop you has made them careless. They're communicating more frequently, taking bigger risks, exposing vulnerabilities they've kept hidden for years. The next 6 days passed in a blur of code, analysis, and digital warfare that pushed my skills beyond anything I had previously attempted. I worked 18-hour shifts, sleeping in 4-hour intervals, sustained by a team of federal analysts who fed me intelligence as fast as I could process it. By Thursday, we'd traced Digital Storm's communication networks to servers in 7 countries. By Friday, I had cracked their encryption protocols and identified the real-world identities of their leadership structure. By Saturday, federal agents in 12 nations were simultaneously raiding facilities based on intelligence I'd provided. The breakthrough came Sunday morning at 3:47 a.m. I'd been working for 36 hours straight when I finally identified the master control system they planned to use for their coordinated infrastructure attack. Not just the location, but the exact vulnerabilities I could exploit to turn their own weapons against them. "Director Hartwell," I called across the command center, my voice hoarse from days of intense focus. "I have it. I can neutralize their entire network." He was beside me in seconds, along with senior analysts from 3 agencies who'd been waiting for this moment. "Show me," he said. What I showed him was beautiful in its simplicity. Digital Storm had spent 2 years building backdoors into critical systems, planning to trigger them simultaneously in what they called Digital Pearl Harbor. But their centralized control system had a fatal flaw. One I could exploit to not only prevent their attack, but to permanently destroy their entire criminal infrastructure. "Execute it," Director Hartwell ordered. I typed the commands that would end Digital Storm's operations permanently. Lines of code that represented months of analysis, weeks of infiltration, and years of preparation. Within 30 minutes, their master control system was not only neutralized, but turned into a weapon against their own network. Across the command center, screens began displaying successful takedowns. Servers destroyed, financial accounts frozen, communication networks dismantled. In less than an hour, an organization that had threatened American infrastructure for 2 years ceased to exist. "Director Hartwell," said Hartwell, his voice carrying a satisfaction I'd rarely heard from federal officials, "you just prevented what would have been the most devastating cyber attack in American history." The aftermath was swift and comprehensive. International arrests based on my intelligence analysis, financial networks traced and dismantled, evidence that would put the surviving members of Digital Storm in prison for decades. Most importantly, the infrastructure they'd spent years compromising was secured, protected, and hardened against future attacks. Monday morning, Agent Price drove me home through neighborhoods that had no idea how close they had come to losing power, water, and communication systems. The federal protection detail was being reduced, but not eliminated. There would always be enemies who remembered what I'd cost them.
As we pulled into my driveway, I could see my parents watching from the living room window. They'd spent 6 days knowing their daughter was facing threats serious enough to require military-level protection. Now they were about to learn that those threats had been eliminated by the same daughter they'd once lectured about realistic career expectations. "Your parents are about to understand something very few people ever experience," Agent Price said as he walked me to the front door. "They're about to learn that their child doesn't just work to protect the country. She actually saved it." He knocked on the door with the kind of official authority that announced mission completion. When Diane opened the door, her eyes immediately went to my face, searching for signs of injury or trauma. When she saw I was safe, relief flooded her expression. "Is it over?" she asked. "It's over," Agent Price confirmed. "Your daughter successfully completed the most critical cybersecurity operation in FBI history. The threat has been permanently neutralized."
Behind her, I could see Richard standing in the hallway, holding the phone like he'd been preparing to make emergency calls for 6 days straight. Director Hartwell asked me to tell you personally that your daughter saved American infrastructure from what would have been the most devastating attack since Pearl Harbor. She didn't just complete her mission, she eliminated the threat permanently. The look on my parents' faces was everything I'd imagined during those long nights of federal briefings and career counseling sessions. Not just pride, but awe. Not just relief, but understanding of a magnitude they'd never expected to experience. Their supposedly failing daughter hadn't just succeeded, she saved the country they lived in from enemies they'd never imagined. 3 weeks after Agent Price had delivered the news that their daughter had saved American infrastructure from the most devastating cyber attack in history, my parents were still adjusting to a reality that bore no resemblance to the life they thought they were living. I found them that Tuesday morning sitting at the kitchen table with a collection of newspaper clippings they'd been gathering since my return. Headlines about the international cyber terrorism takedown, though none mentioned my name or role. Articles about the mysterious prevention of what intelligence officials were calling a digital catastrophe of unprecedented scope. Opinion pieces praising the unnamed cybersecurity specialist who'd protected critical infrastructure from foreign attack. "Listen to this," Diane said, reading from the Washington Post. Senior FBI officials described the operation as a masterpiece of digital counterintelligence that prevented what could have been the darkest day in American technological history. They're calling it the most significant cybersecurity victory since the creation of the Internet. Richard looked up from his own reading. This editorial in the Wall Street Journal says the anonymous specialists who stopped this attack should be considered national heroes on par with World War II code breakers. They were reading about their daughter's work without being able to tell anyone that the anonymous hero the newspapers were praising lived in their house and still left dirty dishes in the sink sometimes. "How does it feel," I asked, pouring coffee and joining them at the table, "reading about work you can't discuss with anyone?" "Surreal," Diane admitted. "Mrs. Patterson asked me yesterday why there were federal agents on our street for a week. I had to tell her it was a neighborhood security assessment. She has no idea her garden is 3 houses away from someone who just saved the country." The irony wasn't lost on any of us. For months, they'd wanted proof of my professional success that they could share with friends and relatives. Now they had proof of accomplishments beyond their wildest imagination, but federal security protocols meant they couldn't tell a soul. "Dr. Wynne called yesterday," Richard said, holding up a message slip with obvious amusement. "She wants to schedule another career counseling session to discuss my realistic employment goals in the retail sector." We all laughed at that. Dr. Wynne, who spent an hour explaining why self-taught computer skills couldn't lead to meaningful work, still didn't know that her reformed patient held security clearances that required congressional oversight. "Are you going to tell her?" I asked. "Agent Sterling advised against it," Diane replied. "She said the fewer people who know about your real work, the safer everyone stays." So, Dr. Wynne will continue believing she successfully counseled a delusional computer hobbyist into accepting retail employment. The past 3 weeks had been a period of quiet recalibration for our family. The ultimatum letter that once seemed so important was now framed on my desk, not as a threat, but as a reminder of how completely people could misunderstand each other. The retail uniform from Harper's department store hung in my closet like a costume from a play I'd never have to perform in again. My parents had thrown away their research folder about cyber criminals and federal investigations, replacing it with materials Agent Sterling had provided about supporting family members who worked in classified fields. They were learning a new vocabulary: operational security, need-to-know basis, cover maintenance, the language of families who lived with secrets that protected national security.
"I have been thinking about something," Diane said, setting down her newspaper. "All those nights you thought you were wasting time on computer games, you were actually working to protect us, not just our family, but everyone's family."
I was protecting the infrastructure that makes normal life possible, I said. Power grids, communication systems, financial networks, the things people never think about until they stop working. But we thought you were failing, Richard said, his voice still carrying traces of wonder at how wrong they'd been. We were so certain that we understood what success looked like. It was the closest any of us had come to directly addressing the magnitude of their misunderstanding. For 6 months, they'd been trying to save me from a life of failure, while I was actually living a life of service they couldn't have conceived. I've been thinking about that too, I said carefully. Maybe the problem wasn't that you didn't understand what I was doing. Maybe the problem was that success in cybersecurity doesn't look like success in any other field. What do you mean? In your world, success is visible. Degrees on walls, job titles on business cards, salaries you can discuss at dinner parties. In my world, success is invisible. The better I am at my job, the less anyone notices because my job is to prevent things from happening. It was a concept that had taken me years to accept. Traditional measures of achievement, recognition, advancement, public acknowledgement were antithetical to effective cybersecurity work. The most successful people in my field were the ones no one had ever heard of. Like doctors, Diane said suddenly. The best doctors are the ones whose patients never get sick. Exactly, except instead of preventing illness, I prevent digital disasters. My secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message. I glanced at it and smiled. What is it? Richard asked. Director Hartwell. He's recommending me for the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The silence that followed was different from the shocked silences of previous weeks. This was the quiet of people absorbing information that exceeded their capacity for surprise. The Presidential Medal of Freedom, Diane repeated slowly. That's the highest civilian honor in the country. It's usually given to people like Nobel Prize winners and civil rights leaders, Richard added, people whose contribution. The ceremony would be private, I explained, reading the details from my phone. No media coverage, no public announcement, just family members and federal officials who understand the classified nature of the work being recognized. We would be there? Diane asked. At the White House? If you want to be, though you'd have to sign additional security agreements and undergo updated background checks. They exchanged a look that contained volumes of communication. 6 months ago, they'd been lecturing me about the importance of realistic goals and practical achievements. Now they were being invited to watch their daughter receive the nation's highest civilian honor from the President of the United States. Of course we want to be there, Richard said firmly. We want to see our daughter receive the recognition she deserves. Our daughter, not their failure, not their disappointment, not their reformed cybercriminal. Their daughter, whose work protecting American infrastructure had earned presidential recognition. That evening, I sat in my childhood bedroom surrounded by the same homework awards and science fair ribbons that had once made my parents proud. Tomorrow, I'd return to work that most people would never know about, protecting systems that enabled the normal life my family and millions of others took for granted. But tonight, for the first time in months, our house felt peaceful. Not the tense quiet of people avoiding difficult conversations, but the comfortable silence of a family that finally understood each other. My parents had learned that success doesn't always look the way you expect it to, that the most important work is often invisible, that their daughter's failures had been cover for accomplishments they'd never imagined possible. And I'd learned something too, that love and misunderstanding can coexist for a long time before truth finally sets everyone free. Outside my window, the neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had 6 months ago. Same houses, same streetlights, same quiet suburban peace. But the threats that had once targeted this normalcy had been eliminated by someone whose own parents thought she was throwing her life away. Some victories don't need applause. Some heroes work in shadows. And sometimes the greatest success is measured not by what people know about your accomplishments, but by what disasters they never have to experience because of them. The countdown was over. The ultimatum had become irrelevant, and the daughter they tried to save from failure had instead saved the country they called home. Justice, it turned out, wasn't always about being proven right. Sometimes it was simply about being understood. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.